My mother-in-law forged my signature under anesthesia to steal my business. I exposed her at her own 40th anniversary party. I was still half asleep from anesthesia, my mouth dry as cotton, when I signed papers I don't remember reading. And 6 months later, I found out my mother-in-law had used them to make herself a co-owner of the veterinary clinic I'd spent 8 years building with my own two hands. That's the short version. The long version starts almost 4 years earlier, on a gravel road outside Millridge, Ohio, in a barn that smelled like hay and antiseptic, where I was helping deliver a breech calf at 2 a.m. for a farmer who couldn't afford an emergency vet from the city. That was my life back then. Old truck, muddy boots, a vet school loan the size of a mortgage, and a dream that I was somehow someday going to open my own clinic instead of driving 40 miles between other people's practices for an hourly wage that barely covered gas. I should tell you a little about who I was before any of this happened because it matters later. I grew up outside Dayton, the daughter of a machinist and a school lunch lady, the kind of household where nobody ever handed you anything. You earned it or you didn't get it. My older sister, Jenna, used to joke that I loved animals more than people because animals never lied to you, they just told you where it hurt. I believed that for most of my life. I still mostly do. I opened Maple Street Animal Clinic when I was 29, in a converted hardware store 2 blocks off the town square in Millridge with a business loan, a co-signer who was my dad, and exactly $4,000 of my own savings sitting in the account the day the doors opened. I remember standing in that empty building the week before we opened, paint fumes still hanging in the air, running my hand along the reception counter I'd bought secondhand from a dentist's office that was closing, and thinking, this is mine. Nobody gave me this. I built it. I met Derek about a year and a half after I opened, when his family's construction company, Whitfield and Sons, got hired to put a new addition on the back of my building so I could finally have a real surgical suite instead of operating out of what used to be a supply closet. Derek was the one who showed up to walk the site with me, tape measure in one hand, coffee in the other, asking real questions about drainage and equipment clearance instead of just nodding along and waiting to talk about himself. He had this quiet, steady way about him, the kind of guy who fixed things without making a big show of fixing them. We started grabbing lunch during the build. Lunch turned into dinner. Dinner turned into 2 years, and then a small wedding in my parents' backyard with string lights and a caterer who did pulled pork because Derek's family, frankly, would have found anything fancier suspicious. Here's a detail that mattered later, even though I didn't know it at the time. From the very first week I met his mother, Carol Whitfield, she asked me what the clinic was worth. Not, how's it going? Not, do you love what you do? What's it worth? She asked it again at our engagement dinner, dressed up as a compliment. Something like, well, aren't you just sitting on a little gold mine out there on Maple Street? I laughed it off. I told myself she was just proud of her son marrying someone with her own business, that some people show interest in strange ways. I want you to remember that detail because it's the first crack, even if it didn't look like one yet. Carol ran that family the way some people run a courtroom. Gary, Derek's dad, built the company with his hands 40 years ago, but Carol kept every set of books, signed every check, and had opinions about every decision anyone in that family made, down to what casserole got served at Sunday dinner. Derek's younger brother Mark had gone into the family business straight out of high school and answered to Carol on everything from vacation days to what truck he drove. Derek was the one who'd gotten out, sort of gone to a 2-year program, learned project management, and worked construction jobs that weren't technically his father's company, though Carol still called him every single week to ask when he was going to come back and, in her words, take his rightful place. I used to feel a little sorry for him about that. I didn't understand yet that feeling sorry for someone and trusting them with your entire financial life are two very different things. Our wedding itself was small, like I said, but Carol still managed to make her presence felt in ways that stuck with me for years afterward. She showed up to the rehearsal dinner with what she called just a little something to think about, a printed spreadsheet estimating what she guessed the clinic might be worth in 5 years if it kept growing at its current rate, and suggested, with a smile that never once reached her eyes, that maybe Derek and I should look into a joint business account for simplicity's sake, once we were officially married. I remember standing there in the restaurant private room, half in my rehearsal outfit, holding that spreadsheet like it was something slightly radioactive and saying, as politely as I could manage, that the clinic's accounts were going to stay separate for liability reasons, which was true, and also just felt like something I needed to say out loud in that room, so there was no confusion later. Derek backed me up that night. He said, Mom, it's her business. That's not really up for discussion. And Carol laughed it off, said, of course, she was only trying to help. Families help each other. I told myself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. It was, looking back, the opening move. For the first year of the marriage, things actually did feel pretty normal, which I think is part of why everything that came later was so disorienting. We settled into our own rhythms. Derek picked up freelance project management work on 2 office renovations across the county that had nothing to do with Whitfield and Sons. And for a while, it looked like he really had built a life a few steps outside his mother's orbit. Sunday dinners at his parents' house were still mandatory, still a little stiff, still full of Carol's pointed little comments about how nice it must be to set your own hours. But I'd learned to treat them the way you treat a dentist appointment. Necessary, occasionally uncomfortable over in a couple hours if you just sat still and let it happen. Looking back, I think that's exactly the posture Carol was counting on. A daughter-in-law who'd learned to tune her out instead of pushback was a daughter-in-law who wouldn't be paying close attention when it actually mattered. The first real crack came about a year into our marriage, small enough that I almost didn't notice it. I was closing out end-of-month numbers at the clinic. I still did my own books back then, hadn't hired an office manager yet, and I found a $200 discrepancy in the account. Not a huge deal. The kind of thing that happens with card readers and vendor invoices sometimes. I mentioned it to Derek at dinner, half a joke. Somebody's stealing kibble money from me. He laughed a little too fast and said, maybe I'd fat-fingered a number somewhere. I let it go. 2 months later, it happened again, 300 and change this time. And when I mentioned it, he said, almost too casually, that his mom had asked him about the clinic's overhead recently, wanted to understand the business better since, quote, family should understand family's finances. I remember standing at the sink with a dish towel in my hand thinking, why would Carol need to understand my overhead? But I didn't push it. I had 11 appointments the next day and a torn ACL surgery on a golden retriever named Biscuit. And honestly, running a solo practice eats every spare hour you have. Looking back, that's exactly the kind of distraction people count on. The real unraveling started with my appendix, of all things. I woke up on a Tuesday night, doubled over in pain so bad I couldn't stand up straight, and Derek drove me to the ER in Millridge doing 80 in a 55 zone. Ruptured appendix, emergency surgery, 3 days in the hospital, and about a week and a half after that where I was, not to put too fine a point on it, absolutely useless. Foggy from pain meds, sleeping 12 hours a day, barely able to remember what day it was. My best friend Steph, who runs the coffee shop 2 doors down from my clinic and has known me since we were both broke 22-year-olds sharing a 1-bedroom apartment, came by every single day that week with soup and gossip, and God bless her, actual competent conversation because Derek mostly just hovered and looked worried and didn't know what to say. During that week, Derek brought a stack of papers to the hospital. He told me it was insurance paperwork and some routine business forms that needed my signature so the clinic's bills could keep getting paid while I recovered, since he'd been helping manage things for me. I remember him holding a pen out to me, and I remember signing my name in 3 or 4 places on pages I could not have told you the content of if you'd offered me $1,000 because I was on a fentanyl drip 40 minutes earlier and could barely focus my eyes on the ceiling tiles, let alone read fine print. I asked him, kind of loopy, what am I signing? And he said something like, just boring stuff, don't worry about it, I've got you. And God help me, I believed him because why wouldn't I? He was my husband. He'd never once given me a reason not to trust him with a pen and a stack of papers. I didn't think about those papers again for months. I don't think I even remembered signing them at all until much later, honestly, the way you don't remember most of what happens to you in a hospital bed on that much medication. I got better. I went back to work. Business was actually booming. I just hired my first full-time vet tech, a sharp 24-year-old named Priya, who I still work with today, and we'd started talking about whether the clinic could support a second doctor within a year or two. Life felt, for a while, genuinely good. Derek and I did our own version of that Sunday ritual you sometimes hear about. For us, it was Saturday morning garage sales, hunting for old veterinary equipment and weird antiques, bringing home things neither of us needed, but both of us loved. There were real moments of tension release in that stretch too, small ones. Steph and I got matching terrible tattoos of a cartoon possum on a dare during a girls' weekend, and Derek laughed so hard when he saw it that he had to sit down. Priya and I once spent 45 minutes trying to convince a stubborn pot-bellied pig named Waffles to get on a scale, and it turned into this ridiculous, exhausting, genuinely hilarious standoff that the whole clinic still talks about. I'm telling you these things because I want you to understand that this wasn't a marriage that looked broken from the outside. It looked, from where I was standing, like it was working. There's one more detail from that stretch I want to mention because it matters later, even though at the time it felt like nothing. That spring, Carol started showing up at the clinic unannounced every few weeks, always with some flimsy excuse, dropping off a casserole dish she'd borrowed. wanting to see how the addition turned out long after it was finished. Once even claiming she just happened to be in the area, despite Millridge being a 50-minute drive from her house. Each time she'd wandered toward the back office where I kept the filing cabinet with the business records, ask a few too many specific questions about how billing worked, whether I used a bookkeeper or did it myself, how the account was structured. I mentioned it to Derek once, half joking, that his mother seemed weirdly fascinated with my QuickBooks setup. Oh, he laughed and said she'd always been like that, nosy about everyone's finances, that it wasn't personal. I let it go, the same way I'd let go of a dozen small things by then. I want to be honest that this wasn't a single dramatic red flag I ignored. It was a slow accumulation of tiny ones, the kind that only look like a pattern once you're forced to lay them all out on a table in order. The turn, the moment everything actually changed, came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon almost 6 months after my surgery, when I got a call from my bank's business department asking to verify a change of authorized signers on the clinic's operating account. I told the woman on the phone she must have the wrong business because I hadn't authorized any change to anything. She read me a name off the account, Carol Whitfield, listed as a co-authorized signer with full access to the account, effective the week I was in the hospital. I actually laughed out loud on the phone, this short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, because it sounded so absurd. I assumed it had to be some kind of clerical error. I asked the woman to send me copies of whatever paperwork had been filed. She emailed them within the hour. I sat at my kitchen table that evening and read through a document titled Limited Business Authorization and Signatory Addendum, with my signature at the bottom, dated the exact day I'd been discharged from the hospital, notarized by a notary I'd never met in my life, at an address I had never once set foot in. I stared at that page for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't just anger. Not yet. It was this cold, sliding sensation, like the floor had quietly tilted 2 degrees under me and nobody else in the room had noticed. I called Steph before I called anyone else because that's just how it's always worked between us. I read her the document over the phone, my voice doing this strange, flat thing I didn't recognize. She went quiet for a second and then said, "That address? Isn't that Carol's church? The one with the little office in the basement?" And it was. It absolutely was. Which meant whoever had notarized that document either worked out of Carol's church or knew Carol well enough to do her a favor without asking too many questions. I did not sleep that night. I lay next to Derek in the dark, listening to him breathe, running through every conversation we'd had in the last 6 months, trying to figure out what he knew and when he knew it, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as grief for a version of my marriage I was starting to understand had maybe never fully existed the way I thought it did. The next few days were some of the strangest of my life because I had to keep showing up to work and being a functional human being while carrying this enormous, unexploded thing around in my chest. I remember standing in an exam room with a client's nervous beagle on the table, making small talk about heartworm prevention, while some other part of my brain was running the same 6 sentences from that email on a loop. She won't even remember signing it. I snapped at Priya once that week over something so small, a supply order she'd placed a day late, that she actually stopped what she was doing and asked me point blank, "Hey, are you okay? You've been somewhere else all week." I almost told her everything right there in the back office, surrounded by vaccine coolers and x-ray files. I didn't, not yet, because Diane had specifically warned me to keep the circle small until we had the paper trail locked down, but I did close the door and just breathe for a minute, which Priya, God bless her, let me do without asking any more questions. There was one night, about 2 weeks into all of this, where I almost gave the whole thing away. Derek and I were watching television, some home renovation show he liked, and out of nowhere he said, completely casually, "Hey, did the bank ever call you about updating your account info? Mom mentioned something about it." My stomach dropped so fast and so hard I actually had to set down the mug of tea I was holding, so it wouldn't shake visibly in my hand. I said as evenly as I could manage, "No, nothing like that. Why?" And he just shrugged and said, Carol had probably just been talking about something else, some general thing, and went back to watching the show like it was nothing. I sat there for the rest of that episode with my heart going so hard I could feel it behind my eyes, replaying that exchange over and over, wondering if he was testing me, wondering if Carol had gotten spooked and sent him fishing. I called Steph the second I got a private minute the next morning and told her what happened, practically whispering into the phone from my car in the clinic parking lot before my first appointment. She said, "Okay, but did you give anything away? Did your face do the thing?" Because apparently I have a thing my face does. I told her I didn't think so, that I'd kept it together, and she said, in that dry way she has, "Good. You've got a better poker face than you think. You just don't believe it because you're a vet, not a con artist." It was such a small, stupid joke, but I actually laughed out loud in my car for the first time in almost 2 weeks, and it helped more than I expected it to. There was another close call about a week after that. Carol called me directly, which she almost never did. Usually everything ran through Derek, and asked in this breezy, over-casual voice whether I'd been happy with how the account situation had been handled while I was recovering. Said something about wanting to make sure I felt supported during a hard time. I remember standing in my kitchen, gripping the phone so tight my knuckles went white, and I told her, as warmly as I could fake, that everything had been fine, that I really appreciated the family pitching in while I was down. She said, "Good, good, that's what family's for." And I hung up and sat down hard on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, and just shook for a solid 5 minutes. It is an incredibly strange, specific kind of exhausting to be gracious to someone in real time while you're quietly building a legal case against them in a folder in your car. Around that same time, Diane brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet, precise woman named Ruth, who specialized in exactly this kind of small business fraud, to trace every single transfer out of my account and match it against Carol's own financial records, which we obtained through a subpoena once the civil complaint was drafted. Ruth's report ran 19 pages, and I remember reading it at my kitchen table late one night with a cup of tea going cold beside me, watching $11,000 turn from a vague, sick feeling in my gut into a series of dated, itemized, undeniable facts. $600 here, transferred the same week as a payment to Mark's truck dealership. $900 there, landing in Carol's account 2 days before a credit card statement showed a payment of the exact same amount. It stopped feeling like a betrayal at that point and started feeling like evidence, which strangely made it easier to carry. Facts don't ask you to feel anything. They just sit there being true. I want to tell you that I confronted him the next morning. I didn't. And here's the thing. Nobody tells you about discovering something this big. The instinct isn't always to blow it up immediately. Mine wasn't. I have a business with 11 employees now. Priya had brought on 2 more techs by then. Clients who depend on me, a mortgage on the building, and a very clear, very cold realization that if I tipped my hand too early, papers could get shredded, stories could get straightened out, and I could end up the crazy wife making wild accusations with nothing to back them up. So instead, over the next 3 weeks, I did something I am honestly still proud of. I got quiet. I got methodical. I called my lawyer, a woman named Diane Kessler, who'd helped me set up the LLC for the clinic years earlier, and I told her everything. She pulled county notary records and found in about 4 days that the notary listed on my document had no scheduling record of an appointment with me on that date, and in fact had a documented church function that same evening that put her nowhere near a notary stamp for hours. Diane also pulled hospital records showing I was still an inpatient, medicated, and physically at Millridge General at the exact time the document claimed I'd appeared in person to sign and swear an oath before a notary. Let that sink in for a second. The way it sank into me sitting in Diane's office with a legal pad full of notes. The document claimed I had personally appeared and sworn under oath that I was signing of my own free will at a time when I was, provably, lying in a hospital bed 40 minutes away recovering from surgery. That's not a gray area. That's not a misunderstanding. That's forgery and false notarization, full stop. And once Diane laid it out like that, in that flat, careful lawyer voice of hers, something in me went very calm and very clear. I remember her asking me, "Do you want to go straight to the police with this, or do you want to build the case first and control how it comes out?" And I told her I wanted to build it first. I wanted to know exactly how deep this went before anyone had a chance to explain it away. So that's what we did over the following month. Diane pulled every transaction on the clinic's account going back to my hospital stay, and here's the part that made my hands shake reading the printout in my own kitchen. Nearly $11,000 had moved out of my business account and transfers to a personal account belonging to Carol Whitfield, in amounts small enough, $600 here, $900 there, to stay under whatever radar she assumed I wasn't watching. Some of it, we later learned, had gone toward a down payment on a used truck for Derek's brother Mark. Some of it had gone to Carol's own credit card. And buried in an email thread Diane subpoenaed later, I promise I'll get to how, was a message from Carol to Derek, sent while I was still in the hospital, that read, quote, "She won't even remember signing it, and by the time she notices anything, it'll all be handled properly and she'll thank us for helping while she was down." I read that sentence probably 30 times. She won't even remember signing it. That wasn't a woman who thought she was helping. That was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and was counting on my anesthesia to cover for her. I confronted Derek first, privately, before I ever went near his parents. I laid the documents on our kitchen table one evening and asked him to explain calmly, no yelling, because I genuinely wanted to see what he would say before I decided what came next. He went very still and very pale, and for a second, I actually thought he might tell me the truth, the whole truth, right there. What he said instead was, "Mom said it was just a formality, just in case something happened to you so the business wouldn't get stuck in limbo. I didn't think it was a big deal. I figured you'd have signed off on it anyway if we'd asked." I asked him very quietly if he had watched me sign that specific document, the one with the notary stamp from a woman I'd never met. He didn't answer that. He just looked at the table. That silence told me everything the $11,000 hadn't already told me. He knew. Maybe not every detail, maybe he told himself some comfortable version, where it wasn't really lying, but he knew that I had not knowingly, consciously agreed to make his mother a co-owner of my clinic, and he let it happen anyway, because standing up to Carol Whitfield had never once in his entire life been something he knew how to do. Diane and I sat down together about a week after that kitchen table conversation with Derek and mapped out on an actual whiteboard in her office every possible way this could go. Going to the police immediately, she explained, would almost certainly tip Carol off within hours, since small-town detectives sometimes know the families involved, and Carol would have a lawyer and a rehearsed story before I ever got the satisfaction of watching her face when the truth landed. Filing a civil suit quietly and settling out of public view would get me my money back fastest, but it would also let Carol keep pretending to herself and to everyone else in town that this had all just been an innocent misunderstanding between family. Neither option sat right with me. I told Diane I didn't just want my money back. I wanted her to have to hear it said out loud in front of people whose opinion she actually cared about, with nowhere left to spin it. Diane, to her credit, didn't try to talk me out of that. She just said, "Okay, then we build it airtight first, and we pick our moment." That sentence became something like a mantra for me over the following weeks. Build it airtight. Pick the moment. I didn't file anything yet. I didn't scream, though, God, I wanted to. Instead, over the next 2 weeks, I did the hardest, most disciplined thing I've ever done in my life, which was act completely normal. I went to Sunday dinners. I smiled at Carol across the table while she asked me, with that same tilted head curiosity she'd had since the day we met, how the clinic was doing, whether I was thinking about expanding. I let her believe she'd gotten away with it, because Diane and I both knew that the moment Carol suspected I'd found out, she'd have a lawyer of her own and a story rehearsed within the hour. I wanted her cornered with no warning, in front of witnesses who mattered to her, at a moment she couldn't control. And I knew exactly which moment that was going to be, because it was already circled in red on the family calendar hanging in Carol's kitchen. Gary and Carol's 40th wedding anniversary party, a big catered thing at the community hall with something like 90 people invited, half the town's contractors and church congregation, and every single one of Carol's oldest, most image-conscious friends. The night of the anniversary party, I wore a navy blue dress Steph had helped me pick out specifically because it had a deep enough pocket to hold my phone, recording tucked against my hip the entire evening. Diane had walked me through exactly what was and wasn't legally solid to say, what documents to physically bring with me in a folder in my bag, and what to do if things went sideways. Derek didn't know what I was planning. I'd told him only that I wanted to be there, that I wasn't ready to blow everything up at a family party, which was, in the loosest possible sense, true. The hall was decorated with white string lights and a banner that said 40 years across the front table. And there was a slideshow of old photos playing on a screen near the dessert table. Carol and Gary Young and squinting into some 1980s camera flash. I mingled. I ate a plate of the good potato salad Gary's sister always brings. I let Carol hug me hello and say, in front of 2 of her church friends, how nice it was to have such a capable, independent daughter-in-law in the family, which, knowing what I now knew, nearly made me choke on my own drink. Around 9, when most of the 90 guests were seated and the toasts had started, Mark stood up and gave a sweet, awkward little speech about his parents. Gary got up next and thanked everyone for coming, thanked Carol for 40 years of, quote, keeping the books straight and keeping him honest, which got a warm laugh from the room. And then Carol stood up to give her own toast. I stood up right after her. I stood up, not shouting, not shaking, though my heart was going so hard I could feel it in my ears. I said loud enough for the tables closest to us to hear clearly, before we finish tonight, I actually have something I need to say too, since we're all here together. Carol's face did this quick, practiced shift into gracious hostess mode, gesturing for me to go ahead. clearly assuming I was about to say something sentimental about family. I pulled the folder out of my bag. I said, I want to thank Carol specifically, actually, for something she did for me last year while I was recovering from surgery. She had a document notarized in my name, claiming I personally appeared and swore an oath at a time when hospital records show I was under anesthesia 40 minutes away. She used that document to add herself as a signer on my clinic's business account and moved almost $11,000 out of it over the following months. The room went so quiet I could hear the ice machine humming in the kitchen behind the hall. Carol's face went white and then blotchy red, that specific color people go when they're caught with absolutely nothing prepared. She said too loud, "That is not what happened. She's twisting this. I was helping her." And I said, calm as I could manage, "I have the notary's schedule showing she wasn't even near that address that day. I have the hospital records. And I have a message you sent Derek saying, quote, she won't even remember signing it." Someone at the next table over gasped audibly. Gary just sat there with his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, staring at his wife like he was trying to reconcile 40 years of marriage with the sentence he'd just heard out loud in front of 90 people. Derek didn't defend her. He didn't defend me either, honestly, not out loud, not in that room. He just sat there, gray-faced, staring at the tablecloth, the same way he had at our own kitchen table weeks earlier. One of Carol's church friends, a woman named Linda, who I'd met maybe 3 times, actually stood halfway up out of her chair like she was going to physically intervene, then just sort of hovered there, unsure what to do with her body before sitting back down. Mark, Derek's brother, had gone completely still with his fork halfway to his mouth, the same way his father had, like the whole family had rehearsed the exact same frozen posture without meaning to. Somewhere near the back of the hall, I heard someone mutter, low, "Oh my God," and I couldn't even tell you who it came from. Carol tried a few more times to spin it, that it was a misunderstanding, that I'd clearly agreed to it at some point and just didn't remember because of the medication, that this wasn't the place. I let her talk herself out for about 30 seconds, and then I said the last thing I'd planned to say that night. "You're right, this isn't really the place. That's why I've already filed a police report for forgery and false notarization, and my lawyer has copies of everything, including tonight." That part wasn't entirely true yet. Diane and I had drafted it and were ready to file the next morning. But by the time anyone in that room checked, it would be. Carol didn't say anything else. Gary quietly asked one of his brothers to help him get her out of the hall. The party did not recover. Half the guests left within 20 minutes. That low buzzing murmur following them out to the parking lot the way it does after something nobody can quite believe they just witnessed. The days after that were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Derek came home that night and asked if we could talk. I told him there wasn't much left to talk about that mattered. I asked him one question, the only one I really needed answered. Did you know at any point before I found that phone call that I hadn't actually agreed to sign that document? He was quiet for a long time and then said, "I told myself you probably would have said yes anyway." I remember looking at him and feeling something close that had been open in me for almost a year. That wasn't an answer. That was a confession dressed up as a maybe. I filed the police report the next morning with Diane sitting next to me. Forgery of a legal document and unauthorized access to a business account are actual crimes in Ohio, not just family drama. And once the notary's records and the hospital timeline were laid out for the detective handling it, the case moved faster than I expected. Carol was charged. She ended up pleading to a lesser charge months later, some fine and probation instead of real jail time, mostly because Diane and I agreed to a civil settlement alongside it that got every dollar repaid with interest inside of 90 days, which honestly mattered more to me than watching her sit in a cell for a weekend. Gary, for what it's worth, called me personally about 2 weeks after the party, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, and apologized, genuinely, in a way Derek never quite managed to. He told me he'd had no idea, that he'd found boxes of old bank statements in Carol's desk going back years that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd quietly moved money where she thought nobody was watching, just the first time she'd gotten caught doing it to someone with a lawyer and a paper trail. Gary told me in that same call that he was moving the company's actual books to a real accountant in town, someone with no family ties, and that Carol wouldn't be touching a single ledger again as long as he had anything to say about it. I believed him. I still do, honestly, based on what I've heard since. Mark, for his part, called me too a few days after Gary did, which genuinely surprised me given how little we'd ever really talked outside of holidays. He didn't apologize exactly, and I don't think it was really his to apologize for him, but he told me he'd suspected something was off with the family finances for years and had just never had proof or the nerve to look for it, and that watching me actually do it had made him finally ask his mother some hard questions of his own about a truck loan she'd co-signed in his name without fully explaining the terms to him. I don't know how that particular thread ended for him. We're not close enough that he tells me those things anymore. But I remember hanging up that call and feeling for the first time in weeks like the damage from this wasn't only landing on me. I filed for divorce from Derek about a month after the party. He didn't fight it much, honestly. I think some part of him understood, once the anger burned off, that he'd made a choice a year earlier that he could never fully undo, and that no amount of apologizing after the fact was going to put us back to where we'd been standing in that driveway the day we met. The weeks right after the party were strange, in a way I don't think I can fully explain to someone who hasn't lived through something like it. There's this specific exhaustion that comes after you finally say the true thing out loud after holding it in for months. Not relief exactly, more like the quiet after a storm you spent so long bracing for that your body doesn't quite know how to stand down. Steph moved in with me for about 10 days, technically to help me pack up Derek's stuff, though mostly she just made sure I ate actual meals and didn't spend every evening rereading that email from Carol like it was going to say something different the 40th time. My sister Jenna drove up from Dayton the following weekend with a trunk full of moving boxes and absolutely zero patience for anyone feeling sorry for Derek, which honestly was exactly what I needed at the time. She sat on my kitchen floor with me one night, both of us halfway through a bottle of wine, and said, "You know the scariest part of this whole thing? You caught it. Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have believed the story they were told and never checked. I didn't have a good answer for that. I just poured us both another glass. The clinic stayed entirely mine. Diane made sure of that from the very first conversation we had, tracing every dollar, every signature, every fraudulent addendum back out of the business records until Maple Street Animal Clinic looked, on paper and in reality, exactly like what it had always actually been. Mine, built by me, owned by me, with nobody's name on it who hadn't earned the right to be there. I did not go easy on Carol in that settlement, and I want to be honest with you. I don't feel one shred of guilt about that. Word got around Millridge the way it always does in a small town. Everybody in that community hall had a phone, and it turns out 90 guests talked to a lot more than 90 other people by the following weekend. Carol lost her spot on the church fundraising committee within the month. A couple of contractors quietly stopped using Whitfield and Sons for smaller jobs, not because of Gary, who most people still respected, but because nobody wanted to risk writing a check that Carol might get her hands on. I didn't orchestrate any of that. I didn't have to. The truth did it on its own, once it finally had room to breathe. Diane handled the actual settlement negotiations over the following 2 months, and I want to tell you honestly that I didn't soften on a single number. Carol's lawyer tried, early on, to frame the whole thing as a family miscommunication that had simply gotten out of hand, and Diane just slid the notary's calendar and the hospital discharge records across the table without saying much of anything at all, which apparently ended that particular conversation fairly quickly. The full $11,000 came back with interest inside of 90 days, exactly like I'd insisted on, along with Carol's name formally and permanently removed from every document tied to the clinic. I remember sitting in Diane's office the day the final paperwork cleared, watching her stamp the last page and feeling this strange, quiet click somewhere in my chest, like a door that had been hanging slightly open for over a year had finally actually shut. It's been almost 2 years now since that anniversary party. I still run the clinic, bigger now than it's ever been. We brought on a second full-time vet last spring, a quiet, sharp young guy named Alex who Priya swears is going to buy me out someday. And honestly, at this rate, I believe her. I bought a small house on my own about 8 months after the divorce. Nothing fancy, but every wall in it belongs entirely to me. No committee meetings required. I picked out every single thing in it myself, down to the paint colors, and there's a particular satisfaction in choosing a slightly too bold shade of green for the kitchen and not having to run it past anybody first. Steph still brings me terrible coffee shop gossip every week, and yes, the possum tattoo has held up fine. Thank you for asking. The clinic itself has changed shape a lot since then, too. We moved Priya into a full practice manager role last year, which she'd honestly earned 2 years before I finally got around to making it official, and she runs the front of house better than I ever did. Alex, the new vet, has this habit of narrating surgeries under his breath like he's hosting a cooking show, which drives me up the wall and also makes the whole team laugh so hard some days that I have to leave the room. We added on again last winter, a second surgical suite this time, paid for entirely out of profit, no loans, no co-signers, no family favors attached to a single brick of it. I stood in that new suite the week it opened, running my hand along the counter the same way I had in that empty hardware store building all those years earlier, and thought, again, this is mine. Nobody gave me this. This time, I actually believed it a little more because I'd had to fight to keep it that way. I haven't spoken to Carol since the day of that police report. Gary and I still exchange a card at Christmas, which surprises people when I mention it. But I think forgiveness and boundaries aren't actually opposites the way people assume. I forgave the parts that were his to own and drew a hard, permanent line around everything that wasn't. Derek reached out once about a year ago, wanting to, in his words, clear the air. I didn't respond. Some air doesn't need clearing, some air just needs distance. I think about that hospital room more than you'd expect, actually, given how far away all of it feels now. I think about the version of me lying there, foggy and trusting, signing whatever was put in front of her, because the person holding the pen was someone she loved. I don't blame that version of myself for a second, for what it's worth. She wasn't careless. She was recovering from surgery and married to someone she had no reason yet to doubt. But I think about her a lot, because she's the reason I read every single document in front of me now. Twice, out loud if I have to, no matter who's waiting on the other side of the table, no matter how tired I am, no matter how much love is sitting in the room. If there's one thing I'd want you to actually take away from all of this, it's this. Somebody handing you a pen and telling you not to worry about what you're signing is never, ever a small moment. No matter how tired you are, no matter how much you love them, no matter how many years you've trusted them before that exact second, read what's in front of you. Ask the annoying follow-up question. Trust the version of yourself that notices $200 missing and doesn't just laugh it off, because that quiet, inconvenient instinct is very often the smartest thing in the room long before the rest of you catches up to it.